Did you know that not all carbon offsets are the same and that we need to remove our carbon emissions permanently to have a chance to reach our climate goals? Well, then you will really enjoy today's episode together with Paolo Piffaretti from CarbonX. He will share with us how he took personal responsibility for the direct and indirect carbon emissions caused by the companies he was working with at his previous job.
And I felt like we were a tool that allowed companies to optimize their conversion rates. And the bottom line is either sell more products or allow for people to consume more content. And so to a certain degree, I kind of felt responsible as well for the fact that, hey, we were either directly or indirectly contributing to the overconsumption, which then ties back to global change or climate change and global warming. And so I felt like, okay, we're in this privileged position. We are somewhat responsible for the situation we're in. What can we do about it? And it was really a personal call.
Why carbon removal technologies are an important tool to fight climate change.
Since the Paris Accord, we've set a goal for ourselves to become net zero by 2050, and that is to avoid the worst effects of climate change. That means that we need to massively reduce our emissions, approximately 80 to 90% of it. And for the hard-to-abate residual emissions that we cannot reduce, we need to think about ways to remove their emissions permanently to reach this net zero.
And how they plan to scale the whole carbon removal industry.
We're spending a huge amount of resources on that so that then we can then come back and help companies make informed decisions. Our mission at CarbonX is to really scale this industry to climate relevance. We want to reach that 10 gigaton goal.
Hello and welcome to the Impactful Ninja Show. I'm your host, Dennis Kampert, and today we're joined by Paolo Piffaretti from CarbonX. Paolo, welcome.
Hi, Dennis. Thank you very much for having me.
My pleasure. Now, before we go in and telling your journey, give us a brief overview. What is CarbonX and what are you doing there?
Absolutely. So CarbonX is a market intelligence carbon procurement platform. And our aim is to de-risk the procurement of permanent carbon removal technologies vital to reach the net zero targets that companies set for themselves.
Wow. Super concrete. And probably for a lot of you, it's like, oh, so many buzzwords. Can we unpack that a little bit? So what would that concretely mean?
So basically, since the Paris Accord, we've set a goal for ourselves to become net zero by 2050, and that is to avoid the worst effects of climate change. That means that we need to massively reduce our emissions, approximately 80 to 90% of it. And for the hard-to-abate residual emissions that we cannot reduce, because we'll still need to, travel, we'll still need to produce certain things, we need to think about ways to remove their emissions permanently to reach this net zero. And basically, companies are asked the same. They're asked to reduce their carbon footprint, but also look at ways to then remove permanently these residual emissions. Now, the technologies that are responsible for this removal are completely new. They're hard to navigate, and we are here to help companies navigate this nascent market to help them best allocate their resources to really promote the technologies that really have a chance to scale to climate relevance and remove the much needed excess carbon we have in the atmosphere.
So basically, you're helping organizations to remove all those carbon emissions that they cannot reduce anymore. And you're doing it in a kind of a marketplace way where you only offer those emissions that can be captured directly.
I would say more than a marketplace, we really do it. We're a portfolio manager. We allow companies to build portfolios. This is not a typical market where you have off-the-shelf credits running around. These are technologies that are being built as we speak. And typically, it's an industry that operates in the future, where they will sell you their future emission of carbon removal credits. And so what we do is that we help companies secure these future emissions of carbon removal credits and manage the underlying risks. And there's mainly two risks. There's an integrity risk. So looking at how, whether or not the carbon is indeed permanently removed, and if it's additional, net negative, verifiable. And there's this also second risk, which is a financial risk. Making sure that if we do buy credits in the future, they do actually materialize into actual negative emissions. And we're not just buying hot air. So we really operate as a portfolio manager to help organizations build up their portfolio and make sure that they get what they sign up for.
Beautiful. I think now we got the perfect context. I'm super curious about diving a little bit deeper into that as well, but let's rewind the story a little bit and focus on what did you do before founding CarbonX? What is your background?
Absolutely. So prior to founding CarbonX, I was head net zero of a big tech company operating out of San Francisco. I myself was in the Parisian team and was very much responsible for setting up their whole net zero strategy. So looking at how to reduce our carbon footprint and first of all, I should say how to scope it, which is a task in itself, reduce it, and eventually looking at how to maximize our climate contribution and, remove these residual emissions. And it's truly in the exercise of the latter that I saw that there were a lot of underlying risks that would make it very hard for me to do my job properly. And so I went out to search for third-party actors or stakeholders that could provide me the guarantees needed to justify such spending or such involvement from my board to my C-levels. I couldn't find any. That's why I then decided to kind of go into Carbon X.
So basically in your day job, you found something that you needed to solve, but there was not a solution. You had a problem you needed to solve. The solution wasn't out there. And with Carbon X, you're building the solution. Let's take one tiny step back before we go into this. So you mentioned that you already worked in a big tech company on that issue.
Yeah.
Can you remember how your first interest came apart? Was that by chance, or was that something you specifically applied for to get started there?
I think it really came from the realization that we as a company were doing extremely well, especially during COVID, where a lot of the businesses needed to digitalize. So we were one of the winners, I would say. And so we were doing very well. And I felt like somehow we needed to leverage this position we're in to then do good or more good than we could. And I felt like we were a tool that, allowed companies to optimize their conversion rates. And the bottom line is either sell more products or allow for people to consume more content. And so to a certain degree, I kind of felt responsible as well for the fact that, hey, we were either, directly or indirectly contributing to this overconsumption, which then, ties back to global change or climate change and global warming. And so I felt like, okay, we're in this privileged position. We are somewhat responsible for the situation we're in. What can we do about it? And it was really a personal call.
Beautiful. And then let's go back to where we ended beforehand. So you mentioned that you were searching for a solution that wasn't there on the marketplace. What was your concrete next steps? Did you directly jump into Carbon X? Did you try to solve it internally with your company? And how did that go ahead?
What happened is basically I started building up internal knowledge. And I think what happened is I came into this market in a very naive manner. I was expecting things to be black and white. I was expecting things to be very clear. This is a good solution. This is a bad solution. And its stakeholders to also provide me with this kind of information. And unfortunately, that was absolutely not the case. And so before kickstarting Carbon X, what I did is I really spent a lot of time digging deep into the science, into the market knowledge, try to get as much information as I could to get to this very contrasted picture where I could very simply say, this is good, this is bad. And I think when you get to that level where you start to have a clear understanding of, how things should work and how they shouldn't, this was, I think, the most basic step to then thinking about, okay, do I need to do this at a larger scale? Is this much needed? And as I got more knowledge and I started interacting with more stakeholders in the ecosystem, that's where I saw where this was a really recurring issue, that a lot of people were struggling with this opacity around this market, the fact that there weren't any regulatory framework then. It was nascent industry, so there were only a handful of players. And even, the World Organization or international organization or even, entities such as, the European Commission was not providing any guidelines on that specific topic. And so that's when I felt like, okay, maybe then it's worth, with all the knowledge that I've accumulated, seeing whether or not other people would be interested in that.
So here, 3 really interesting topics out there. One, kind of being naive enough to get started. The second thing, from the outsider perspective, thinking about what should be in place. And even the most basic things, realizing that they're not in place. And the third one is then also reaching out and speaking to other organizations and figuring out they have the same issue or the same problems that you have.
Absolutely. No, it's exactly that.
What was your next concrete step? Did you try to build it up internally first, or did you directly, at this point, said with all the knowledge and with all the research that you've done, let's go full board on that?
What I realized is I needed to spin out of my organization because this was a job that, dedicated my full attention and full time. And for me to do it properly, I felt like, okay, I needed to give it my undivided attention, I should say. So the first thing is indeed was to then start thinking about, okay, spanning out, moving away from organization so that this becomes my main focus. Because otherwise there's always conflicting opportunities. You're always going to be asked to do something else. And when the matter at hand is that important, I think it requires your undivided attention. And the second step that was vital was finding the right person to do it with. And in my case, what I realized is there was really a need for someone to help me analyze, deep dive into each of those businesses, each of those technologies. Someone that had a keen expertise in delving deep into projects that are in the becoming. And so, finding the right person was really the second step that was essential.
Give us an overview from the timeline. What would you say, firstly, when was that when you took the decision, found the right person, and how much time has passed since you kind of made the decision internally and kind of backtracking a little bit?
Absolutely. So I think it took me 3 to 4 months to get a good understanding of the problematic, starting to kind of map out the ecosystem, understanding what were the underlying trends, and actually build up a case that, would allow me to convince someone that is also, and typically I was looking for someone that was very experienced, very sought out. So you need to make sure that you're on solid grounds before proposing anything to anyone, especially if that person is an expert. And so really I spent, I would say 34 months really working hard in providing the structure of this initial framework. And then it took us, I would say, from the moment I first pitched the idea to my now co-founder, to then him and me starting this full time, it took us, I would say 6 months.
Oh, wow. So kind of like 3-4 months to figure everything out, pitching the idea. 6 months later, let's say 9-10 months afterwards, and you're kind of ready to get started. When was that roughly?
That was in May 2022 is really when we really officially kicked it off.
Okay, so a bit more than 1.5 years ago.
Absolutely.
How did you then get started? So you have a co-founder, you have the research, you're already on fire to get going. What was the concrete first steps for you?
Well, basically I made a list of things that I needed. There were 3 things I needed to be. I needed to be an expert and a recognized one within this industry. And that was checked because I was head and CEO of this big tech company. So I really had responsibilities. I understood what was required from the corporate side, and it gave me legitimacy to reach out to other companies and tell them about these issues. And then second was also getting funding. So from the moment we started working together, we already started engaging in with other potential VCs and investors in helping us, raise some funds for us to hit the ground running. And the third step was getting our case proven. So we needed a successful case study. And so really finding a first real big client to prove that indeed there is a need for that.
So basically you had to work on 3 sides similar to make it happen and then provide the case study. So once, the carbon offsets is one big part. The organizations who could be partnering, who could be interested in it, and at the same time also get the funding, putting all of these things together, provide the first case study and go ahead from there.
Exactly.
When it comes to these kind of 2-sided, or in this case even 3-sided markets, normally one of these is easier than the others. Which one would you say was easier for you to get? Which of these sides? Or where was the biggest challenge and maybe convincing someone?
What was difficult is getting first buyers. I think since it was a nascent industry, a lot of people were asking us, you're going to face a lot of issues with supply. So these actual companies that are doing carbon removal. And what we found and what we saw was that actually, given the necessities for it and the underlying trends, there was a growing number of it. What was really harder to find were companies and stakeholders willing to buy a hefty price to finance these solutions. Especially that since now we're in the early days, we haven't reached yet the economies of scale that make them bearable for most companies. These are very expensive solutions. And so finding companies that were leading to spearhead this debate and to be the kind of the first testers of these solutions and be willing also to take on a bit of risk, because indeed, these are technologies that are being built, the measurement, reporting and verification standards, they were also being developed. Everything is being built as we speak. So companies, first they needed to, finding companies that were willing to spend that much money without all the guarantees, etc. It was a hard task, I would say.
Was it a communication challenge for you as well? Because it sounded like one of the key points for you was also the risk management for these companies. At the same time, that's Absolutely. One of the key points to basically convince them of as well.
Yeah. And the way we do this still today is just by providing this much needed transparency. And we try from the very first interactions to bring this visibility. We try to be as transparent as we can in the ways of how we assess this project, where do we think the risks are. And we've developed a whole framework around that, but also providing clear visibility on specific market data, such as their price points, their availability, the volume effects, and benchmarking that across a specific removal pathway, so that companies then really get to see, okay, this is indeed potentially the MVP, the most viable, player, and these others maybe not the best ways forward, etc. So really providing this transparency is essential.
Nice. Walk us away along this journey now from the starting point with the first case study, getting funding, getting the organizations on board on both sides, providing the offsets or carbon removal, getting the first clients. Along the journey, creating the transparency as one of the key points. Where are you now, and what else has happened along the way?
So really what happened is Sebastian and I we launched CarbonX. Our focus was then very rapidly on analyzing the market. So building up our expertise and our understanding of, the CDR industry. And what I mean by CDR is carbon dioxide removal. That's the acronym for these technologies that remove carbon permanently. So really building up our database so that we could then go back to companies and organizations and suggest them what were the best, technologies and underlying projects to move forward with. Mm-hmm. The journey very rapidly was on one end, focusing on the CDR aspect of our organization and on the revenue. So really also in parallel, talk to leading organizations and convincing them to start, deploying a budget dedicated to funding these initiatives and building a case so that we could, rationalize it to their board levels, their C levels.
Nice. Was there any challenges or any surprise along the way that even though you did all the research, that kind of, you didn't really expect?
I think what was a bit surprising is, even though I think this is an industry that is driven by people that, want to do a lot of good, I think, unfortunately, business kind of gets in the way and sometimes greed as well. And so what I was surprised was to see that, unfortunately, that not the best behavior was in that market, and a lot of the fundamentals needed to run a successful market was sometimes lacking. And I thought that was a bit strange, given the fact that this was an industry where we're all working towards a common goal. And us as buyers, we were doing our best to rationalize this and help these technologies get funded. But on the other hand, what I saw was the same trends I saw in the SaaS industry, where sometimes people, instead of thinking long term, they were more thinking about how to maximize their margins, how to maximize their gains, leverage information asymmetry, which in the end I think impacted negatively this market. And I think a reason why it takes a bit more time than expected to kickstart this market, even though now we're really starting to see a growing trend, is in part due to the opacity of this market.
And it also sounds like one of the big challenges in the market when it comes to greenwashing, where a lot of companies just say they want to make a difference. They show to the consumers and to all the world that they're making a difference, but they might not be engaging and putting the dollars behind where the worth is, and going for some solutions that might not be as effective as they proclaiming they are.
Absolutely.
And it also sounds like
absolutely.
The solution that you're going for is one that kind of prevents that whole greenwashing part.
100%. We at CarbonX, and we really are amongst the very, very few, and I think that we can count it with one hand, and I think with a couple of fingers. We focus strictly on permanent carbon removals because today science endorses only these technologies, and especially when it comes to mitigating, one's emission. When a company emits a ton, that ton stays indefinitely in the atmosphere. So the only way to counterbalance it in a meaningful way is that your negative emission is as permanent as your original emission. And the point is, these technologies, they come as I mentioned earlier, at a hefty price, and therefore most reduction pathways are much cheaper than these technologies. So typically, when a company starts to consider seriously these technologies, it typically has a really well explored all of the reduction possibilities, because everything else is much cheaper than these technologies at this current stage. So that's why we would say that this is the first market mechanism that allows companies to fully appreciate the cost of emissions. Because when you're asking a company to pay upwards, $450, $500 a ton, and they have thousands, if not millions of tons to remove, and of course, they'll make sure that they've maximized the reduction before spending that kind of money.
Yeah, that's also one of the things that we've seen. We've done a lot of research in reducing carbon emissions with different kinds of carbon offsets, from the super permanent ones to not so much. And there's some key criteria, like how permanent is it? And there's a vast difference between just sucking out of the air, storing it permanently. How immediate is it? And what kind of other factors are there? Like, is it actually additional, or would that have happened anyway? And when you put all of these things together, there's like a massive difference from just thinking about the Earth and the emissions. Do you suck it out? Is it right now? Is it happening only because you made it happen and it's permanent? Or do you plant, let's just say for the sake of the example, since there was some issues around, do you plant some trees that would have been planted anyway, that will be materializing maybe in 5 to 10 years in a maximum span, and something could or could not happen? And the problem that we've seen with the market as well is that a ton versus a ton without any kind of differentiator. So there's always like a lot of communication issues between why is this ton so different than the other ton. And I feel like there's maybe some regulation or maybe some other frameworks that are still missing that need to be dominant.
Exactly. And the good thing and the good news here is that as of a few months ago, there is now a framework, and it's in the final stages of being approved by the European Commission, and it's called the Carbon Removal Certification Framework. So the EU CRCF, that's the acronym. And that means for the very first time, to what you're saying, we finally have a framework that defines what is an acceptable carbon removal credit. And it defines exactly what is permanence, because a lot of the organizations in standard were using the word permanent without defining what permanence is. Yeah. We know what is also required in addition. So like, as you mentioned, additionality, the fact that it needs to be verifiable, it needs to be net negative. So for 1 ton removed, you shouldn't emit 2 tons. and also limiting the reversal risk. What are the guarantees we have that once it is removed, it is not re-emitted? And the great thing is that here the European Union adopted a very conservative, somewhat narrow definition of what is acceptable. And though there is a high chance that they might broaden it a little bit, they really focused on these technologies where it is crystal clear that carbon has been removed permanently with no chances of being remitted. Yeah. And they typically now only consider geological storage or mineralization. So here we're looking at geological timescale. It's carbon removed not over a couple of years or centuries. We're talking millennia. So that's a great thing.
Nice. Yeah, I didn't even know about it. I'll need to have a closer look into it. Super excited that something's coming out on that end as well.
Yes.
Now let's have a look into the future as well before going into the next parts. How do you envision the journey with CarbonX? What's happening next for you guys?
So right now at CarbonX, we're really specializing we're in these CDR technologies and building up these portfolios and making sure that they materialize over time, because companies that sign up to these technologies or for these technologies, they typically sign multi-year agreements. And what they typically do is that they build up their inventories of such technologies. And so what we're doing right now is really we're completing, and it's a continuous effort, our vision of the market. So we really are sourcing and evaluating and analyzing all the different projects that are popping up everywhere. We're spending a huge amount of resources on that, so that then we can then come back and help companies make informed decisions. Our mission at CarbonX is to really scale this industry to climate relevance. We want to reach that 10 gigaton goal. And for that, we need to make sure that then we identify which are the players that will help us get there. I mean, the CDR players, and provide them with the advanced market commitments so that they can get the funding needed to scale their infrastructure, scale their businesses, and get to these gigatons. So that's really what we're focusing on. CarbonX is really about anything that has to do with financing these technologies, be it on the procurement side, but eventually we'll also look at also the financing in itself.
Beautiful. Now, before we go into the learnings as well for your personal life, how, like anyone listening to us now, how could we best engage with you? How could we support you? Or who would be a target group that you would be happy, to share more information with?
I think for us is, if you're part of an organization that has set a goal for itself to become or reach net zero, and you haven't defined yet what your strategy is for carbon removal or to mitigate your residual emissions, then I think that's a good time to then start think about that. And we're always open to discussing with the organization, helping them structure their procurement strategy to avoid costly mistakes. So a great thing would be to have people reach us out based on their organization's requirements, and we would be more than happy to help them and navigate this very complex market.
Nice. We'll put all the links down below and also in the show notes. Let's make a transition to your personal life now. What would you say, since basically starting with the previous tech company and now even much more working on all the carbon removal parts with CarbonX, how would you say has that impacted your personal life?
It's such a reward. And I have to say, first, I have to thank my partner because she supports me a lot. It's when you kickstart a business, of course, there's a lot of risks attached to that. And if you do not have someone that, supports you, then it becomes a very daunting, difficult thing to do. But no, it's the support. And then personally, it's working for something that has a meaning for me. Working on climate change, on mitigating that gives me so much purpose every day. It's a fuel that never runs out. And it's something I recommend to everyone, work for something that has a meaning.
Beautiful. Now, let's go into the final question. If you had one tip to share with our audience how we could become more impactful, what would your number one tip be?
Transparency. We always need more transparency. If you can help the world by bringing more data, valuable data, and if we can show it to the world openly, the better we are. Right now, unfortunately, a lot of the bad things that are happening to us is due to information asymmetry, to lack of data, and to opacity. So I think a general thing is, let's all work towards transparency. Let's make sure that everyone can have access to good information so we can make these informed decisions. That's what matters.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for sharing all that. Thanks so much for your work you're doing with CarbonX, Paolo. It was a pleasure having you.
Likewise. Thank you, Dennis.
Awesome. And to everyone else, thanks so much for joining us as well, and stay impactful.